I remember the moment in 2014 while watching the pilot episode for the CW series, The Flash. As the episode was reaching its final moments, a thought hit me. Oh my god, they're actually going there. The scene in question contained a tease and potential setup for an adaptation of the 1980s comic Crisis on Infinite Earths. For those of you not super well versed in DC Comics history, this was a massive story built off of 50 years of shared history and continuity, spanning a multiverse with countless parallel worlds, all coming together to fight a being called the Anti-Monitor, resulting in the destruction of all but one of those worlds and the death of Barry Allen, the Flash. It's the kind of story that can only happen in superhero comics, relying on the reader understanding an incredibly complex mythology and history and being familiar with dozens and dozens of characters. And here it was, albeit briefly, on a CW show. Something had changed. There's constantly a lot being written about how comic books and superheroes are all over movies and TV, and how it's changing Hollywood by popularizing the idea of the shared cinematic universe. And that's all true, but I think this rise of comic book adaptations is doing way more than that. I think it's introducing fundamentally different storytelling structures and techniques to cinema. See, film and comic book storytelling have always functioned very differently. Films are, for the most part, self-contained. The aim is to tell a complete story in about 2 hours, so one sitting. And even in movie franchises, that doesn't change very much. A sequel only comes out every 2 or 3 years and is generally less interested in advancing an ongoing story than telling a similar one. Movies have never been very big on serialization. Even the longest running movie series of all time, James Bond, has almost no continuity to it. You can watch the movies in any order, starting anywhere, and there are unlikely to be any story threads continuing from the previous films. Basically, movies outside of maybe Star Wars have never had much interest in long-form storytelling. Comics, on the other hand, are all about long-form storytelling. And for the sake of this discussion, we're sticking pretty much just with mainstream superhero comics. These tell an endless ongoing story that has spanned decades, with countless series weaving together and building on one another to create a massive shared history, which obviously is incredibly dense. Instead of trying to reach new readers, comics tend to be aimed at longtime fans who already have a deep knowledge of the history and continuity. So all that considered, how have movies dealt with adapting comic books when the two storytelling approaches are so radically different? Well, for several decades, the usual approach was to cram a square peg into a round hole. The whole complicated universe of characters would be stripped away, focusing on a world in which only the one individual hero exists. These movies would almost always be origin stories featuring a hero's first encounter with a famous villain who would usually die at the end. These massive ongoing sagas were reconfigured into the standard standalone action movie format. Look, I don't need to spend a lot of time talking about what Marvel Studios did and how in 2008 they changed everything with a single post-credit scene. 4 years later, all of their characters teamed up as the Avengers, and the great promise of the comic book movie was fulfilled. But not quite. The Avengers was a team-up movie, a crossover, characters from separate movies showing up in the same movie. But this had happened before. In Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, Abbott, Costello, Frankenstein, and the rest of the Universal monsters appeared in the same movie. And in 1994, the original Star Trek crew met the Next Generation crew in Star Trek Generations. It hadn't been executed quite like this, but similar things had happened. But now there was proof that the cinematic universe worked, and everyone wanted one, and this is usually where the discussion ends. But I think this is just where it starts to get really interesting. So let's keep going. If you look at earlier superhero movie franchises, there is very little continuity. Each of the Burton and Schumacher Batman movies has almost nothing to do with one another. Like, Bruce Wayne doesn't even have a love interest stick around for more than one movie. This line is just about the only reference to an earlier film in that entire series.
Who let Vicky Vale into the Batcave? I'm sitting there working and I turn around, there she is. Oh, hi Vic, come on in.
But in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the movies do exactly what the comics have done for decades, telling separate stories that weave together into one giant ongoing story, building on each other to create this dense history and continuity, and it expects the audience to keep up. So when Tony Stark appears in Spider-Man Homecoming, the movie not only assumes that we know who he is and have seen his solo movies, but also that we're aware of developments in his personal life from Captain America Civil War, like how he and Pepper Potts broke up, because they get back together, and it's nice. But it's the upcoming Avengers Infinity War that takes it further, translating a comic book storytelling model that has never been put on film before. The event. So if you're not a comic nerd, let me explain what this means. An event is a major story that a publisher will usually do like once per year. This is DC Comics' current one. It's called Metal. It's a lot of fun. It's a big story that usually happens in its own miniseries that grows out of story seeds that were planted a year or more earlier, so there's a lot of build up to it. It's huge in terms of scale and impact, and will usually feature like every character in the universe. It'll spill over into all their individual series and tie into everything, so it'll affect everybody. I mean, that's what they're supposed to do. Events are often not great, but when done well, they represent the kind of storytelling that only superhero comics can do. Well, until now. See, Infinity War isn't just another Avengers movie. It's a Marvel Universe movie, and it's built off of storylines from a ton of different movies. Thanos was first set up in Avengers back in 2012, and he's the father of two of the main characters from Guardians of the Galaxy. It continues the stuff with Captain America and Wakanda from the end of Civil War, and plus it heavily features those Infinity Stones that have been in like every Marvel movie. So even if you're just a casual Marvel fan and you only like a handful of the characters, Infinity War is being positioned as a thing you have to see because it's so huge it will affect everybody, which is exactly how events have always worked in comics. So if you just like Spider-Man from the new movie, you gotta see this, because Spider-Man's in it. So I think it's this, not the original Avengers, that is the ultimate realization of the potential of comic book movies. They've come so far that they haven't just translated the characters and universe on screen, we've gotten to full-on giant crossover events. In which case, I really hope this means we get a Secret Wars 2 movie featuring the Beyonder in his wacky disco jumpsuit. But as bonkers as the notion of Infinity War is, I think it actually gets crazier from here. So jumping over to DC's movie universe, you may have heard that what was once a movie about the Flash is now a movie called Flashpoint, and that is very, very interesting. See, in 2011, DC Comics rebooted their whole comic book universe, revamping and updating and changing and de-aging their characters as a way of starting from scratch and attracting new readers. It's actually way more complicated than that, but if you want to know more, you can just read about it on Wikipedia. But in order to get from the old DC universe to the new DC universe, they did an event called Flashpoint, in which the Flash traveled back through time and changed stuff, and those changes had a ripple effect through space and time, giving us a new continuity and a new status quo. So now they're gonna do a Flashpoint movie. What does that mean? Well, DC's movie universe has not gone as smoothly as Marvel's, and last year, Jeff Johns, who was DC's biggest comic book writer for the past 20 years, was placed in charge of DC Films. Jeff Johns is the guy who wrote the original Flashpoint comic and is known for having this really deep love and respect for continuity. So if he wants to make some major change in the comic, or like bring a character back from the dead, he'll find a creative way to do it using continuity and playing within the rules. For example, back in like 2005, he wanted to bring back Hal Jordan as Green Lantern, but in the early 90s, Hal Jordan had gone crazy, turned evil, changed his name to Parallax, and murdered all the other Green Lanterns. So what Jeff Johns did was reveal that he had actually been possessed by this demonic entity called Parallax, and that's what made him do those things. It wasn't really his fault, so now he could be Green Lantern again, and everything was good. That's the kind of storytelling Jeff Johns does. He'll use continuity to get things the way he wants them. It's been reported that Johns did not love the ultra-grim Zack Snyder approach of the earlier movies, so now that he's running the show, how might he get things on track? By using Flashpoint to literally rewrite history, fix past mistakes, and oh yeah, recast Batman, because Ben Affleck keeps talking about how he doesn't want to do that anymore. Just 20 years ago, a new Batman movie might mean a new actor in the lead role, a radically different tone, Harvey Dent changing from a black guy to a white guy. Continuity did not matter. But now, these things happen via an elaborate time travel plot with ripple effects through several franchises literally rewriting a shared continuity. For comic book fans, that's old hat. We've seen it like a million times. But for general audiences, that's really, really weird. That kind of storytelling has never happened before in cinema. The closest would be the time travel related reboot premise of the J.J. Abrams Star Trek, but that wasn't radically reworking an ongoing franchise. There was the potential for that at the end of X-Men Days of Future Past, when history was literally rewritten, but then the following films just went back in time again and ignored that, so whatever. What impresses me most about this is what it seems audiences are actually cool with. For so many decades, when Hollywood would adapt comic books, the rule was always tone it down, make it simple, we know better. They assumed audiences wouldn't go for the weird shit, that only nerds wanted that. But now, these giant blockbuster movies costing hundreds of millions of dollars are asking audiences to understand and remember huge amounts of continuity, to follow crisscrossing storylines through multiple series, and potentially to accept a time travel-caused cross-universe retcon. It's clear that if the audience's connection to the characters is strong enough, and there's enough built-in brand appeal, audiences are willing to commit to more than they've been given credit for. So my question is, can this storytelling extend beyond just superhero movies? There are two series currently that are kind of doing this. There's Star Wars, which has obviously had a deep continuity for decades, but there's been a shift recently with the arrival of the spin-off movies, the Star Wars stories. Like in Rogue One, Bail Organa, who has not appeared since 2005's Revenge of the Sith, shows up, and the movie expects that the audience will be aware enough of the lore to know who that guy is. And then there's my favorite, the Fast and Furious movies, where the continuity grows denser with each successive film, as they tie in and bring back each minor character that ever appeared in an earlier movie and expect the audience to just keep up. While the shared cinematic universe is the big magic concept that every studio seems to want, what's more important is creating an ongoing story that audiences will actually want to follow for movie after movie. Now that these new possibilities have been discovered and audiences have accepted them, assuming they accept Flashpoint, are we going to see them cropping up in new context? Like, can you build to an event outside of blockbuster sci-fi action movies? Now, it would be a huge oversight to not address the importance of TV. Over the past 20 years, coinciding with the rise of comic book movies, there was the arrival of DVR and streaming, and TV became way more serialized. With the most popular and most acclaimed TV series, there's been a big shift away from the classic episodic storytelling. TV has been getting audiences accustomed to long-form storytelling. And bringing it back to The Flash on the CW, there's a whole universe there now of DC Comics shows that all tie together and annually do a big crossover event. Like Infinity War, but on a smaller scale and budget. The translation of comic book storytelling structures to cinema has shown that audiences can handle way more dense continuity and serialization than Hollywood had given them credit for. So I'm wondering, who's gonna take advantage of that? When do we see more long-form storytelling in movies? But look, guys, what's really important here is that next year, normal people, like our parents, are going to have to know what Cable's backstory is. That's insane. Hey guys, sorry this video was a little late this week. I got kinda sick, which just slowed down the editing, but thankfully I am recovered now because this weekend we are shooting the Christmas video for this year, as well. Just there's more stuff, there's a bunch of cool stuff coming, so stay tuned for that. If you like these videos and want to help us make more of them, then you should check out the Patreon. And if you want to yell at me about stuff and get updates on the cool things that we're working on, like what we're shooting this weekend, follow me on all the social media links, and I will see you next Wednesday, hopefully.